The smoke clings to her lungs like claws. A 14-year-old girl stumbles barefoot across the ruins of her village in Khwarezmia. The steppe wind is thick with ash, carrying the stench of burning thatch and charred flesh. Her ears ring with the sound of hooves thundering in the distance, Mongol horses moving like an endless tide across the horizon. Her name will never be written down. Her story will never appear in chronicles. To the Mongols, she is not a daughter, not a sister, not a child. She is property, just another piece of living tribute taken from a land that dared to resist. She tries to swallow, but her throat is raw with smoke. Every step across the dry soil cuts her bare feet, now blistered and bleeding. Behind her she hears sobs that blend with the crackle of fire. Women her mother's age, her grandmother's age, pulled by ropes, driven like cattle. Soldiers laugh as they prod them with spears, amused at the way the women stumble, terrified, exhausted, stripped of dignity. The girl presses a trembling hand against her chest, still in shock from what she saw only hours earlier. Her father cut down in front of her eyes, his head severed with a single sweep of a Mongol saber. Her brother, only 12, dragged toward a ditch and thrown in with the rest of the boys, their cries silenced under a hail of arrows. The Mongols spared no males old enough to hold a weapon. They took the women instead, always the women. She doesn't know yet that this is only the beginning. She doesn't know that within 3 days she will be marched across scorched plains in a human caravan, roped at the neck to other captives, beaten if she stumbles. She doesn't know that she will be paraded before strangers in Samarkand, stripped naked, her body inspected like livestock. She doesn't know that her life will be reduced to a price. What she knows is dust, hunger, fear so deep it feels like her chest has been hollowed out. The Mongol soldier riding closest to her doesn't even look at her face. His eyes are cold, calculating, already assessing her value. Is she strong enough to carry water? Young enough for a nobleman's tent? Fertile enough to breed more slaves? To him, she is a number in an inventory, an entry in a ledger of conquest. The Mongols were not just conquerors of cities and destroyers of armies. They were traffickers of flesh, and while history remembers their empire for its speed and scale, stretching from the Pacific to the Black Sea in less than a century, what gets buried under tales of military genius is the human cost. Behind every victory inscription, every burning city, every pile of skulls, there were thousands of women like her, captured, punished, enslaved, erased. The chronicles brag about it openly. Rashid al-Din, the great Persian historian who served the Mongol court, recorded how after the fall of Nishapur, the men were slaughtered, but the women were divided as spoils. Chinese annals describe entire villages where the males were exterminated and the women distributed among the warriors. Russian chronicles speak of mothers and daughters dragged into captivity, never to be seen again. But statistics carved into parchment or etched into stone don't capture the reality of what those women endured. The Mongols perfected not just the art of war, but the art of humiliation. They used terror as a weapon so effective that entire cities surrendered without a fight. And at the center of that terror stood the fate of captured women. This girl, stumbling barefoot through the smoke of her ruined home, represents more than herself. She embodies the untold story of millions. For every woman like her, there were countless others. Persians, Russians, Chinese, Koreans, Armenians, Georgians, dragged across an empire that thrived on blood and fear. Children in her village once told stories of Genghis Khan as if he were a demon from another world. Now she knows the truth. He was worse than a demon. He was real. And his empire fed itself on lives like hers. Her wrists are raw from rope burns. She tries to loosen the knot binding her to the line of captives, but each tug only makes the fibers cut deeper. Ahead of her, a woman collapses. A soldier dismounts, lifts a whip of braided leather tipped with iron, and strikes her until she staggers back to her feet, sobbing. The others watch in silence. They've already learned that pity is dangerous. Any attempt to help would bring the same punishment. Or worse, the girl remembers the temple in her village, where priests once promised that the gods would protect them if they remained faithful. She wonders where those gods are now. She wonders if the gods see her walking half-naked through the steppe, her dignity torn away, her childhood ended in a single night of fire and blood. What she cannot know is that her suffering will never be recorded by the victors. Mongol generals will boast of cities conquered, not children enslaved. They will count their spoils in gold and silk, not in broken lives. History will glorify their empire as a marvel of logistics and strategy, while the stories of women like her vanish into the dust. But the bones that archaeologists find centuries later tell the truth. The fractured spines, the branded skulls, the teeth worn down to nubs. These silent remains whisper of women who labored until their bodies collapsed, who endured punishment so horrific they seem unimaginable today. The 14-year-old girl does not know that she will never return to her village. She will never again see the river where she used to fetch water with her mother. She will never hold her younger sister in her arms. She does not know that her future is chains, that her children, if she survives long enough to bear them, will inherit those same chains. She only knows one thing in this moment. Her life as a free person ended the second Mongol hooves thundered across the steppe. And this is just the beginning. Because what follows, the punishments, the humiliations, the systematic breaking of women's bodies and spirits across the Mongol Empire, is a history that most textbooks refuse to tell. A history that transforms the legends of Mongol greatness into something far darker. A history where women were not just collateral damage, but deliberate targets in a campaign of domination that stretched across continents. The story of the Mongol Empire cannot be told through maps and dates alone. To truly understand its power, you have to hear the voices of the silenced, to see through the eyes of the girl stumbling barefoot through smoke, rope around her neck, every step dragging her further away from freedom. This is her story. This is their story. This is the story of the most horrific punishments for female slaves in the Mongol Empire. The girl's chains were not an accident. They were the lifeblood of an empire. Every Mongol raid was more than conquest, it was commerce. Behind the thunder of hooves and the smoke of burning cities, there was a ruthless logic at work. Women were as valuable as gold and often easier to obtain. The Mongols had perfected the art of turning war into a supply chain. Villages were stripped not only of wealth, livestock and grain, but of human bodies. Men old enough to fight were executed. Children too small to work were discarded. But the women, young, strong, fertile, were spared only to be enslaved. This was no side effect of conquest. It was a deliberate system. The Yasa, the law code attributed to Genghis Khan himself, treated captives as legitimate spoils of war. A soldier's share of women was as much a reward as a share of horses or sheep. To take part in a Mongol campaign was to expect not only plunder, but people, living property whose bodies and labor could be consumed. Chronicles from Persia tell of entire caravans of women driven east after the fall of cities like Urgench, Samarkand and Bukhara. Chinese records describe how captured girls were divided into categories, some for the Khan, some for his generals, the rest distributed among common soldiers or sold in markets that fed the empire's growing appetite for slaves. Russian annals, written by priests who watched their congregations destroyed, record the sorrow of mothers dragged away in chains, their children clinging to them until soldiers tore them apart. For the Mongols, women were classified with chilling efficiency. The most beautiful or accomplished were taken into noble households or royal harems. Others were forced into domestic service, grinding grain, weaving, carrying water, tending fires. Those deemed strong were sent to the fields or to herd livestock. Even women too old for labor were sometimes kept as breeders, paired with enslaved men to produce more captives for the next generation. It was a system designed not just to conquer, but to recycle human life into endless servitude. The slave trade networks that fed on Mongol victories stretched across continents. From Karakorum, the imperial capital on the steppe, human beings were transported along the same Silk Road routes that carried silk, spices, and silver. Persian women might end up in China. Chinese girls could be found in Samarkand. Russian captives were sold in markets that reached all the way to the Middle East. Slave caravans moved alongside merchants and diplomats, proof that in the Mongol world, flesh was as legitimate a commodity as any luxury good. Even religion was no refuge. Mongol leaders tolerated many faiths, Buddhist, Muslim, Christian, but this tolerance did not extend to the enslaved. Temples and mosques were plundered, their women taken alongside secular captives. Sacred vows meant nothing against Mongol law. If you were captured, you were property, no matter your faith or lineage. The scale is almost impossible to comprehend. When Genghis Khan's armies stormed Nishapur in 1221, Persian chroniclers claimed 1.7 million people were killed, numbers exaggerated perhaps, but meant to convey devastation. What is less exaggerated are the records of tens of thousands of women dragged away alive. For the Mongols, death was a tool of terror, but enslavement was profit, and profit built an empire. The labor of enslaved women cooked the meals that fed Mongol warriors, wove the tents that sheltered their camps, and bore the children that expanded their numbers. The empire that stretched from the Yellow Sea to the Danube was built not only on cavalry charges and siege engines, but on the backs of women reduced to possessions. Yet most histories don't tell you this. Schoolbooks will praise the Mongols for their trade routes, their postal systems, their unification of Eurasia. Museums will marvel at their horsemanship and their diplomacy. But behind every caravan of silk, there was a caravan of chained women. Behind every treaty, there were women traded like gifts. Behind every boast of Mongol tolerance was a law code that codified human beings as spoils. If you think history books should have told you this instead of fairy tales about Mongol tolerance, support the History Scar. Don't scroll past without subscribing, because if we don't tell these stories, no one else will. For the 14-year-old girl taken from Khwarezmia, the march is only beginning. She doesn't know if she will be sent east to Karakoram, west to Samarkand, or north into the forests of Rus. She only knows that she is no longer a person. She is an item in the ledger of war, a commodity on the Mongol marketplace, and soon the punishments will begin. The girl from Khwarezmia is not alone. She is one among thousands. Her village is gone, reduced to ashes and bones, and now begins the ritual of sorting. This was the Mongol method: burn first, divide later. Entire towns were set ablaze, the flames rising as signals to surrounding regions. Men were slaughtered in ditches, their corpses left unburied to rot beneath the sun. Survivors, mostly women and children, were corralled like livestock into open squares, forced to kneel while soldiers rode past them, pointing, laughing, evaluating. The process was mechanical. A soldier dismounts, grabs a woman by the chin, tilts her head toward the light. He examines her teeth to estimate her age, squeezes her arms to test for muscle, checks her hips to judge whether she might bear children. Another soldier rips away clothing, leaving her trembling in the cold wind, her shame an object of amusement. A gesture from the commander determines her fate: concubine, servant, field laborer, or death. It was inspection as humiliation, designed not only to classify but to crush. Every strip of fabric torn away reminded the women they were no longer daughters or wives. They were inventory. Resistance was not tolerated. A Khwarezmian woman who spat at her captors is forced to the ground. In front of the others, her nose is cut away, blood spraying across the sand. Another who screamed too loudly has her ears sliced off as a lesson. Punishment was spectacle, meant to teach silence. The Mongols understood terror better than any empire before them. They didn't just kill, they displayed. When a mother tried to shield her daughter during inspection, soldiers dragged the child away and executed her in front of the woman's eyes. Her screams echoed into silence. The message was unmistakable. Any attempt to resist would cost not only your life but the lives of those you loved. It was cruelty sharpened into policy. Brands of ownership followed the inspections. Heated irons pressed against flesh until the smell of burning skin filled the air. Cheeks, shoulders, and forearms bore symbols of Mongol clans, marks that could never be hidden. For the captives, the pain was not only physical but permanent. Every scar a reminder that they belonged to someone else. No escape was possible when your body itself betrayed you. The march began as soon as the branding ended. Women were roped together at the neck in long human chains, each forced to walk in rhythm with the others. If one stumbled, all were dragged down. If one collapsed, the soldiers beat her until she rose, or left her to die in the dust. The journeys lasted for weeks, sometimes months, across deserts, steppes, and frozen forests. There were no provisions for food or water. Starvation was not an accident, but a test. The Mongols calculated that losing a portion of captives on the way was acceptable, better to weed out the weak before reaching the markets. The bodies of those who fell were stripped and abandoned, their bones left for scavengers. Pregnant women marched until their legs gave out, forced to keep pace even as contractions racked their bodies. Children tied to their mothers' waists cried until the soldiers silenced them with sword or fist. Nursing infants starved when their mother's milk dried from dehydration. The chain never stopped moving. European observers who encountered Mongol slave caravans were horrified. Friar Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, a papal envoy in the 1240s, described women tied together with ropes, driven across the steppe like animals. He wrote that their condition was so miserable that even the Saracens treat their captives better. Medieval chronicles from Rus recorded that captives marched naked through snow, their bodies blue with frostbite, while Mongols laughed at their suffering. To Europeans accustomed to their own brutalities, Mongol methods seemed beyond comprehension, terror elevated to art. Yet for the Mongols it was simply efficiency. Slaves were not investments until they survived the journey. Until then, they were expendable. A human chain was easier to manage than carts or cages. Starvation cost nothing. Fear kept the line moving. At night, the women were penned into makeshift enclosures. Guards circled them with horses, whips at the ready. Fires burned, not for warmth, but to remind the captives that the soldiers were watching. Any attempt to escape meant death, not only for the runner but for those nearest her in the chain. Humiliation continued even in captivity. Women were ordered to perform tasks without rest, fetch water, carry wood, grind grain for the soldiers. Those who failed were whipped with braided leather, each lash cutting deeper into raw flesh. Those who cried out too loudly were gagged with filthy cloth. It was not only the body that was punished, but the spirit. The Mongols understood that to enslave effectively, you had to break people completely. Public mutilations, endless marches, constant hunger. These were tools of domination as powerful as any sword. The girl from Khwarezmia walks with her eyes fixed on the ground, too afraid to lift her gaze. She no longer dreams of escape. She only hopes to survive another day, another hour. Each step drags her further from her past, deeper into a future where punishment is routine and survival itself is uncertain. Her story is multiplied by thousands. Each woman in the chain carries her own nightmare, a home burned, a family murdered, a body branded. Together, they form the silent foundation of the Mongol Empire, and this is only the beginning. For once the captives reached the markets, the punishments would not end. They would evolve. They would become more systematic, more precise, more degrading. The Mongols were not content simply to enslave. They perfected the art of turning human suffering into profit. When the long march finally ended, the punishment only transformed into a new stage of humiliation, the slave markets. In Samarkand, in Bukhara, in Karakoram, the Mongol capital itself, captives were paraded before strangers as though they were livestock. The women who had survived starvation, mutilation, and branding now faced the degradation of being priced like goods. They were herded into open squares, their chains rattling as soldiers prodded them forward. Merchants, nobles, and warriors gathered to inspect the fresh supply. Some women were stripped naked in front of the crowds, their bodies turned into public spectacle. Men jostled one another to examine skin, hair, and teeth, to press muscles, to calculate how long a body might last under labor, or how pleasing it might be in a bed. For the Mongols, the slave market was not hidden in shadow. It was a theater of power, staged in the open for all to witness. The laughter of buyers echoed as women stood trembling, unable to cover themselves, forced to endure groping hands and mocking jeers. Families that had somehow managed to survive together until this point were deliberately separated. Mothers were pulled from daughters, sisters sold into different households, children torn away screaming as they were dragged to separate pens. This fragmentation was intentional. The Mongols understood that solidarity bred rebellion. Isolation bred submission. By scattering captives across cities and clans, they ensured no kinship bonds could be rebuilt. Chronicles from Persia describe markets where infants were sold alongside their mothers, only to be purchased by different masters within moments. Russian annals lamented that girls were taken in dozens and dispersed across the steppes, their cries lost in the tumult of bargaining. Chinese accounts tell of noblemen choosing dancers for their harems, while common soldiers claimed the strong for field work. The system was methodical. Beauty became a currency for pleasure, strength became a currency for labor, and age determined value. The nobles reserved the right of first choice. They selected entertainers, singers, dancers, concubines, who would be paraded at feasts or confined within private tents. Generals claimed women as household servants. Common warriors received what remained, often older women or those deemed less desirable. Even then, these captives would toil endlessly, grinding grain, hauling water, sewing garments, cleaning stables. No woman escaped the categorization. But what struck foreign observers most was the mockery woven into every sale. Women were not just examined, they were humiliated. In some markets, they were forced to dance, stumbling through routines under the threat of whips, while crowds laughed at their awkwardness. Others were compelled to sing in languages their captors could not understand, their voices drowned in derision. A refusal meant punishment on the spot, beatings, mutilations, or public stripping before jeering buyers. A Persian chronicler wrote bitterly of one market where women were lined up and painted with ashes and chalk to emphasize their bodies. Buyers circled them, shouting insults, while children threw stones. It was not commerce alone, it was ritualized degradation, reinforcing that these captives were less than human, their dignity crushed before ownership even began. For the 14-year-old girl from Khwarezmia, the market is the cruelest blow yet. She clings desperately to her younger sister's hand as they are herded forward, both trembling under the eyes of strangers. But the grip is broken in an instant. A soldier drags the younger child toward one group of buyers, while the older is shoved toward another. Their screams echo across the square, drowned only by the noise of bargaining. They will never see each other again. And this was by design. The Mongols understood that nothing destroys resistance more effectively than destroying the family itself. A slave without kin is a slave without hope. The economics of the markets were precise. A young, attractive woman might fetch the price of several horses or a cache of weapons. A strong-bodied woman could be valued as equivalent to a wagon of grain. Pregnant women were considered double property, valuable for the promise of future children born into servitude. Elderly captives fetched almost nothing and were often left unsold, discarded as worthless. All of it was recorded in ledgers, as if these lives were simply transactions. A Persian document from the 13th century notes women listed by origin: Khwarezmian, Russian, Persian, each entry followed by weight, condition, and price. It reads less like history and more like the logbook of a butcher. And yet, outside the markets, later historians painted the Mongols as tolerant, as visionaries who opened trade across Eurasia. They praised their postal systems, their diplomacy, their cultural exchanges. But here, in the squares of Samarkand and Karakoram, you see the truth. An empire that thrived on human misery, on the sale of women as commodities. Most people will just shake their heads and move on. But if you feel anger knowing these women were erased, prove it by subscribing to the History Scar. Or go ahead, leave a comment saying why you think their story isn't worth remembering. For the women of Khwarezmia, Persia, Rus' and China, the market was only the beginning. What awaited them in Mongol households, fields, and harems would stretch their suffering across decades. The humiliation of the square was not the end of their punishment, it was merely the gateway. For those who survived the march and endured the humiliation of the markets, slavery did not end with purchase. It began. The women taken into Mongol households were transformed into living tools, worked until their bodies broke, punished until their spirits collapsed. Their new lives were measured not in years but in tasks: how much grain could be ground before dawn, how many buckets of water hauled before nightfall, how many fires tended before the body gave way. Every day began before sunrise. Enslaved women were shaken awake, often with the butt of a whip, and sent immediately to labor. The grinding of grain was among the most common and most punishing tasks. Huge stones had to be pushed back and forth for hours. Kneeling in the dirt, the motion repeated, until joints swelled and cartilage wore away. Archaeologists examining skeletons from steppe burial pits have found women in their 20s, with knees fused at permanent angles, their bones twisted by years of forced grinding. The damage was so severe that even in death, their bodies told the story of endless repetition. Hauling water was no less destructive. Clay jars filled at rivers or wells weighed up to 60 pounds. Women carried them on their shoulders or balanced them on their heads, walking miles across uneven terrain. Rashid al-Din, the Persian historian at the Mongol court, wrote of women whose necks bent permanently forward, their vertebrae compressed until their spines curved like bows. What Mongol masters saw as strength, the women experienced as agony. Tending animals consumed the rest of the day. Women shoveled dung from horse pens, milked mares for kumis, and drove herds across frozen plains. The Mongol reliance on horses meant endless care, and any mistake was punished swiftly. A spilled bucket of milk, a horse injured through mishandling. Both could mean a beating severe enough to break bones. Branding was another punishment, a hot iron pressed to the back or shoulder as a permanent reminder of failure. And still, the duties multiplied. Camps had to be raised, tents stitched and mended from hides, fires fed through the night. At feasts, enslaved women served for hours, kneeling to pour wine, fanning nobles as they drank, holding trays until their arms went numb. The women were expected to be invisible, present only as extensions of their masters' wealth and comfort. To Mongol households, enslaved women were not people. They were instruments. A whip ensured obedience. Hunger ensured speed. Silence ensured survival. Chronicles record the punishments in chilling detail. Rashid al-Din tells of a slave girl beaten nearly to death for breaking a drinking bowl. Her master ordered her body dragged outside, left in the snow until she froze, and then replaced her with another purchased days later. The casual tone in his writing reveals the mindset. Women were disposable, interchangeable, their suffering unworthy of record, except as an anecdote. The punishments extended beyond the physical. Public humiliation was woven into daily existence. If a woman failed to prepare a meal properly, she might be forced to eat dirt before the household, laughed at as she gagged. If she spilled water, she might be stripped naked and paraded through camp, jeered at by soldiers. The degradation was never incidental. It was deliberate, designed to erase any remaining fragments of dignity. Starvation was another weapon. Women judged lazy were denied food until they collapsed. Some households measured punishment not in lashes but in meals withheld. The body weakened, but the work never stopped. Women dragged themselves to tasks, too afraid of a beating to rest, too weak to perform without pain. The skeletal evidence left behind confirms the brutality. At sites linked to Mongol encampments, archaeologists have found female remains, with spines compressed from carrying loads far heavier than the body was meant to bear. Arm bones warped from endless repetitive motions, teeth worn down from grit in poorly ground flour. In one case, a woman's shoulder bones fused unnaturally, evidence of a lifetime spent hauling buckets or carrying hides across her back. These were not isolated stories, they were systemic. The Mongol Empire required labor to fuel its endless expansion, and women filled that need in silence. Unlike warriors, their names were not recorded. Unlike nobles, their possessions were not preserved. What remains are bones, twisted by toil, whispering the truth that chronicles often ignored. In households, enslaved women blended into the background of wealth. A nobleman's feast was only possible because women had slaughtered animals, cooked the meat, kneaded the bread, fetched the water, and served the wine. A Khan's tent gleamed with embroidered fabric, only because women worked their fingers raw weaving linen and stitching hides. The grandeur of Mongol luxury rested invisibly on their exhaustion, and yet, even when they did everything asked, punishment lingered like a shadow. Any moment could bring the lash, the iron, or the humiliation of being reminded that they were not human in the eyes of their masters. The girl from Khwarezmia, torn from her sister in the market, now grinds grain in a nobleman's camp. Her arms ache, her knees burn, her back screams with pain. She dreams of her sister's face, but the dream only deepens the ache in her chest. Each morning she hopes for a miracle. Each night she knows she will wake to the same endless cycle. This is what slavery meant in the Mongol Empire, not just chains and markets, but a daily life of punishment so constant, so ordinary, that they rarely appeared in the records, because to the Mongols these punishments were not punishments at all. They were routine. The chronicles that glorify conquest rarely mention the nameless women kneeling in the dirt. But their bodies, their bones, and their silence tell us everything. For many enslaved women, survival in a Mongol household meant far more than grinding grain or hauling water. Their bodies were not just tools for labor, they were considered possessions for pleasure. The Mongol elite maintained vast harems, collections of women drawn from every corner of the empire. To foreign visitors, these harems were described as dazzling arrays of beauty, a mark of Mongol prestige. But for the women inside, they were prisons of velvet and gold, places where captivity wore the disguise of luxury. The Khans themselves kept hundreds, sometimes thousands of women. The secret history of the Mongols hints at the scale of this practice, though it cloaks it in the language of honor and gift-giving. Women captured in campaigns were presented to the Khan as tribute, their transfer described with the same pride as herds of horses or wagons of silk. Rashid al-Din, the Persian chronicler, lists the royal women of Genghis Khan and his successors not by choice or romance but by origin. Tangut, Khitan, Persian, Khwarezmian, Russian. They were trophies of conquest, their bodies catalogued like spoils of war. Girls as young as 8 or 10 were singled out for this fate. Too young for labor, too young to understand, they were groomed for a lifetime of sexual servitude. They were fed more carefully than field slaves, bathed, dressed in fine clothing, and trained to anticipate the desires of their masters. The grooming was framed as privilege, but in truth, it was preparation for abuse. By the time they reached puberty, their futures had already been determined. In the Mongol world, this was considered honor. To be taken into a Khan's harem was presented as elevation, a mark that a woman had been chosen for intimacy with the empire's most powerful men. Chronicles describe it with reverence, as if these women should have felt fortunate. But beneath the veneer of honor lay coercion. There was no choice, no consent, no escape. Refusal was unthinkable. Submission was survival. Even the wives of Khans were not spared from this system. They were chosen as symbols of alliance, often seized from noble families of conquered peoples. A captured princess might be declared a great wife, her marriage celebrated as political genius. But her role was no different from that of the slave concubine, to serve her husband's bed, to bear sons who would continue the empire's line, to embody the submission of her people through her own body. And when the ruler died, these women often followed him into death. Accounts from the Yuan dynasty in China and from Persian chroniclers describe concubines and servants executed at the funerals of Mongol lords, buried or burned to accompany their masters into the afterlife. It was framed as devotion, as if they volunteered to serve beyond death. But the skeletal evidence tells another story. Women with wrists bound, throats cut, skulls crushed. These were not willing companions. They were silenced victims, sacrificed to reinforce the mythology of male power. This practice shocked foreign observers. When the Mongols extended their rule into Islamic lands, Muslim chroniclers expressed horror at the way women were slaughtered for funerary rites. Chinese scholars, who recorded elaborate burial practices of the Yuan emperors, noted the custom of sending women to serve in the tombs. Yet inside the empire, this was normalized, a divine right of rulers to carry their property into eternity. The abuse was reframed in language that stripped it of its violence. To Mongol rulers, taking women was not violation but privilege, a symbol of heaven's favor. The empire itself was believed to exist by mandate of the eternal blue sky, and thus the desires of its leaders carried divine sanction. If a Khan wanted a concubine, it was the will of the heavens. If he killed her to accompany him in death, it was the order of the cosmos. This ideology permeated every level of society. Not only Khans, but generals, nobles, and even common warriors took concubines from among their captives. It was considered a reward, a perk of military service. The Yasa, the Mongol legal code, made no provision for the protection of enslaved women. Their use was unrestricted, their status unquestioned. They were possessions, no different from horses or weapons, and could be given, traded, or discarded at will. For the women inside the harems, survival meant performing enthusiasm for their own captivity. Chronicles mention entertainments provided by royal concubines, dances, songs, banquets, where women were paraded like ornaments. Their bodies became symbols of Mongol domination, displayed not only in private chambers but before entire courts. The humiliation was layered. They were not just abused, they were showcased. The girl from Khwarezmia, who once ground grain and carried water, now finds herself in this world of false splendor. She is bathed, dressed in silks, her hair oiled and braided. For a moment, she almost believes she has escaped the worst of slavery. But then she sees the terror in the eyes of the others, girls younger than her, trembling when soldiers approach, whispering of the nights they cannot speak about aloud. She understands, this is not freedom. This is another kind of prison. And she knows what fate awaits when her master dies. She has already seen older women carried away, never to return, their bodies later whispered to have been buried alongside the lord they served. Her life is not her own. Even her death will be dictated by the whims of men who see her as nothing more than ornament, possession, property. This is where many will stop watching because it's uncomfortable. But these women didn't have the choice to look away. Don't dishonor them. Subscribe to the history scar so their suffering isn't erased again. The Mongol Empire dazzled the world with its size, its armies, its wealth, but at its heart stood a system of sexual slavery so vast that entire generations of women disappeared into harems, never recorded by name, never remembered except as a tally in chronicles of conquest. Behind every golden cup raised in a Mongol feast was a concubine who poured the wine. Behind every victory celebrated in song was a woman whose body was taken as tribute. And the horrors did not end in private chambers. They spilled into public life, into punishments, into branding and mutilation that left scars across women's bodies and across history itself. If daily labor and sexual slavery reduced women to property, the Mongols had another method to ensure their ownership could never be forgotten. They inscribed it onto the body itself. Branding was among the most common. Heated irons were pressed into cheeks, foreheads and arms until skin sizzled, and the smell of burning flesh filled the air. The marks were crude but permanent, simple lines, clan symbols, or characters denoting property. A woman branded this way could never escape her identity as a slave. Even if she fled hundreds of miles, her scar would betray her instantly. The branding was not hidden, it was spectacle. Other captives were often forced to watch as one woman screamed beneath the iron so they would know what awaited them if they disobeyed. It was punishment and warning at once, a ritual of pain that etched fear into memory as much as it scarred skin. Tattooing carried another layer of degradation. Unlike the decorative tattoos prized in some steppe cultures, these were not chosen or celebrated, they were imposed. Women were marked with inked symbols that identified their origin, their owners, or even their roles. A Khwarezmian woman might be tattooed with geometric lines across her arms. A Russian girl might have her thighs inked with symbols meant to signal her use as concubine. These marks transformed the body into a record of ownership, a living document that stripped women of anonymity forever. But it was mutilation that left the deepest scars, both physical and psychological. Ears cut away as punishment for speaking back. Noses sliced off for attempted escape. Lips branded or scarred into grotesque shapes that turned expressions of pain into permanent masks. These punishments were deliberately visible. The Mongols wanted women's bodies to announce their submission with every step they took, every glance cast their way. Whipping left its own language on the skin. The braided leather lash carved long, parallel welts that healed into raised ridges. The rawhide whip cut deeper, slicing flesh into scars that twisted across backs and shoulders. The knotted rope created circles of burned skin where flesh tore under impact. Experienced overseers could read a woman's back like a book, each scar a record of an infraction. whether real or imagined. Hair, too, became a canvas for punishment. In Mongol society, free women's braids were symbols of dignity and beauty. Enslaved women were denied that dignity. Heads were shaved brutally with dull blades, leaving bloody cuts across scalps. The hairlessness marked them as property in public, an absence that shouted ownership as loudly as any brand. Sometimes, hair was burned off with caustic substances, scarring follicles so that it never grew back. Other times, women were forced to wear humiliating hairstyles, uneven tufts hacked crudely, braids tied into knots that mocked their cultural traditions. These alterations did more than mark. They destroyed identity. A woman stripped of her hair, scarred with burns, and branded across the face could not walk through any settlement without being recognized as a slave. She became a walking reminder of Mongol dominance, her body transformed into a billboard of conquest. The girl from Khwarezmia learned this lesson early. One morning, after failing to grind enough flour for her master's meal, she was dragged into the center of the camp. A hot iron was pressed against her forearm. The searing pain was unlike anything she had ever known. The skin bubbled, the stench clung to her nostrils for days, and the scar remained for life, a symbol that she belonged, body and soul, to someone else. She did not need a mirror to know she was marked. Every stare from strangers reminded her. Foreign observers recorded these horrors with disbelief. A Franciscan friar who traveled through Mongol territory in the 1240s wrote that he saw women with ears missing, scars across their faces, and shaved heads. He noted that their appearance alone proclaimed them slaves. Persian chroniclers compared them to animals branded for pasture. Chinese records described maidens marked with knives and fire who were paraded in markets as proof of Mongol conquest. These marks served a broader purpose than mere punishment. They were propaganda. Each scarred body was a living declaration of Mongol supremacy, proof that even flesh could be conquered and reshaped. By forcing women to carry these scars publicly, the empire reminded everyone, friend, foe, and captive alike, of its total control. The punishments were designed to outlast rebellion, to ensure that even if a woman's spirit remained unbroken, her body would always bear the stamp of submission. In death, too, these marks lingered. Archaeologists have uncovered skeletons with facial bones scarred from healed mutilations, teeth filed into grotesque shapes, skulls branded with burns that seared through flesh into bone. Even after centuries, the evidence testifies to the cruelty etched into women's lives. For the enslaved, there was no escape from this system. Work could be endured, hunger could be ignored. Even sexual violence, unbearable as it was, could sometimes be survived in silence. But a brand across the face or the loss of a nose could not be hidden. It followed them forever, a scar more binding than chains. The Mongols understood this, and they wielded it with precision. Pain was temporary, fear was fleeting, but scars, those were eternal. And so the women became living symbols of conquest, their very bodies used as messages of dominance. Each brand, each mutilation, each forced haircut whispered the same truth. There is no escape. You will never again be your own. You will carry us with you on your skin until you die. For Mongol masters, control over enslaved women was not confined to private chambers or hidden punishments. It was displayed, exaggerated, performed before others. Public humiliation was itself a form of punishment, a reminder to everyone that women's bodies belonged not to themselves, but to their owners and to the empire. Festivals provided the perfect stage. During celebrations of victory, enslaved women were dressed in torn or transparent clothing and forced to dance before crowds of warriors. The dances were rarely graceful. These were women dragged from villages, untrained, trembling with exhaustion. Their movements, awkward and desperate, became a source of laughter. Soldiers threw scraps of food or stones as they swayed, mocking every misstep. The humiliation was the point. The dances weren't meant to entertain, they were meant to degrade. In some festivals, the women were ordered to perform songs in their native languages. No one understood the words, but that did not matter. Their accents, their strange syllables, were ridiculed. If they faltered, if their voices cracked, The lash corrected them. What had once been sacred folk songs, lullabies whispered in cradles, became weapons of shame twisted into entertainment. Punishments were staged in public squares as living lessons. A woman accused of theft might be stripped naked, tied to a post, and whipped until her back ran red, all while townspeople and soldiers jeered. Another accused of laziness might be forced to crawl through the dirt, dragging a heavy log across the square, while children shouted insults and adults spat in her face. The Mongols understood spectacle. They knew that making punishment public extended its power far beyond the victim. It warned every captive, every free subject, that defiance carried a price too heavy to pay. Even cruelty took on theatrical forms. Some enslaved women were forced to fight animals for entertainment. A chained wolf might be loosed against a terrified woman armed with nothing but a stick. Sometimes dogs were set upon them while crowds cheered. Other times women were forced to fight one another, given blunt knives told that only the victor would eat. Hungry and desperate, they turned on each other under the watchful eyes of laughing masters. For the Mongols, it was not enough to dominate their enemies. They needed to see them humiliated, debased, broken publicly. Birth, too, became a spectacle. In noble households, enslaved women who went into labor were often forced to give birth in open courtyards. Masters and their families would gather to watch, commenting on the woman's cries, mocking her pain. Bets were placed on the sex of the child. A healthy boy brought celebration, not for the mother, but for the value of new property. A frail child, or worse, a stillbirth, brought disappointment and scorn. For the enslaved woman, the most intimate moment of her life was turned into a circus of shame. Her agony was not private. It was public theater. Imagine being forced to give birth in public while strangers mocked you. If you're still here listening, it means you care. Subscribe to the History Scar, or go to the comments and tell us why you won't. Foreign observers who encountered these rituals recorded them with horror. Persian chroniclers described captives mocked at feasts, made to serve wine while being pinched and slapped by drunken soldiers. A Franciscan envoy to Karakorum reported seeing enslaved women crawling across banquet floors, used as human stools for nobles reclining on cushions. Russian accounts told of women paraded through villages, forced to carry banners of conquest above their heads while their bodies bore fresh scars from whips. Each story reveals the same truth. Humiliation was as central to Mongol power as warfare. The girl from Khwarezmia endured this degradation firsthand. One night, during a festival celebrating her master's victory, she was ordered to dance with a chain around her neck. Every misstep drew laughter. A soldier shoved her, and she fell, face scraping against the dirt. The crowd roared with amusement. Her humiliation was their joy. In that moment, she understood that pain was not her only punishment. So was being forced to provide amusement through her own suffering. These rituals extended even into death. Women executed for disobedience were sometimes displayed in grotesque ways. Bodies hung at gates, corpses left propped against posts, mouths forced open with sticks to create parodies of laughter. Their deaths were staged as warnings, their bodies transformed into final performances of submission. It is easy to think of empire as maps, battles, treaties, but here in the festivals and squares of Mongol cities, we see empire for what it truly was: control enforced through humiliation, domination performed as spectacle. These public punishments were not excesses. They were integral, woven into the culture of conquest. The Mongols ruled by fear, and nothing spread fear faster than turning human agony into entertainment. For the enslaved women, there was no corner of life untouched by this cruelty. Labor broke their bodies. Sexual servitude stripped their dignity. Branding scarred their flesh. Public humiliation destroyed their very sense of self. Every space, market, square, household, festival, was another stage for punishment. And yet, even worse, fates waited. For the enslaved women of the Mongol Empire, death was rarely release. When bodies failed, or when masters died, the final indignities began. Because in the world of the Mongols, even in death, women remained property. For enslaved women in the Mongol Empire, suffering did not end with death. If life was filled with humiliation, their deaths were marked by denial. Denial of dignity, denial of remembrance, denial of humanity itself. When a woman's body weakened from years of grinding grain or hauling water, when her hands became too gnarled to weave, when her knees could no longer bend to labor, she was no longer useful. The Mongols had no place for the frail or the old. Many were abandoned, cast out to die alone on the steppe. Others were killed quickly, their deaths described by chroniclers with a casual tone, as if discarding worn-out tools. Rashid al-Din wrote of women released from service when they could no longer work, a euphemism for murder. Some were strangled quietly. Others were left at the edges of encampments, where wolves and vultures ensured that nothing remained by morning. To the Mongols, there was no contradiction in treating animals with reverence, while enslaved women were left for scavengers. Horses were buried with honor, women were thrown away. Even greater horrors came with the funerals of Mongol lords. The empire's elite believed they should not enter the afterlife alone. Just as wives and concubines had served in life, so too should they serve in death. And so, when a nobleman or general died, enslaved women were often executed to accompany him. Persian chroniclers describe mass killings at funerals, where dozens of concubines were strangled, their bodies arranged in lines beside the tomb. Chinese accounts note that women were buried alive within sealed chambers, their screams muffled by stone and earth until silence fell. In Russ's legends, whispers told of captives burned on pyres, their ashes mingled with those of their masters. The practice was framed as devotion, as if women had volunteered to follow their lords. But the evidence is clear. These were not willing sacrifices. Archaeologists excavating burial sites linked to Mongol nobility have found female skeletons with wrists bound, skulls fractured, throats slashed. They were killed methodically, their deaths ritualized to legitimize the power of men who had owned them. The obsession with secrecy and royal burials intensified this cruelty. Mongol rulers feared that knowledge of their tombs might invite desecration, so their resting places were hidden. The cost of secrecy was paid in blood. Chronicles tell of funeral processions where slaves and guards were slaughtered after completing their duties, their bodies scattered to erase the trail. Others were sealed alive inside tomb passages, left to suffocate in darkness so that no one could reveal the site. The living became part of the architecture of death. For the enslaved women, this meant that even death offered no escape. A woman who had been forced into a Khan's harem might spend her final hours in a subterranean chamber, pressed into the dirt beside her master's body, gasping for air as stones were laid above her. She would die knowing that her existence was reduced to service, not only in life, but beyond it. The contrast between the treatment of nobles and slaves is striking. When a Mongol Khan died, his body was wrapped in silk, placed in ornate coffins, surrounded by treasures, horses, and weapons. Priests recited prayers, rituals were observed, and generations remembered his name with reverence. His afterlife was carefully prepared, his memory immortalized. The enslaved women killed to accompany him received no such honor. Their names were not recorded, their bodies were not preserved. They were dumped in pits, buried beneath the grandeur of others, denied even the smallest rites. They were erased deliberately, their deaths hidden so thoroughly that only the silence of bones centuries later could speak of what had been done. The girl from Khwarezmia lives with this knowledge every day. She has seen older women disappear quietly, taken beyond the camp and never return. She has heard whispers of funerals where concubines vanished, their absence explained only with the phrase, "They went with him." She knows, with a hollow certainty, that her own life will not end gently. Her body, whether broken by labor or taken for a burial, will not be honored. It will be disposed of like waste, her name already forgotten. Foreign observers recoiled at these practices. The Franciscan friar Giovanni da Pian del Carpine wrote of funerals where many women and servants were slain to serve their lords in the next life. Persian historians condemned the killings as barbaric, though their words could not prevent them. Chinese records describe Yuan dynasty tombs where maidens were sealed within, as if their presence were ornaments for eternity. The Mongols themselves did not hide this reality. They celebrated it as proof of their power over both life and death. To them, enslaved women were not individuals. They were property, objects to be used in life and discarded in death. Their erasure was deliberate, a final act of domination that ensured they would never be remembered as people, only as shadows in the background of Mongol glory. And yet, even in silence, the bones remain. In burial pits uncovered near Karakoram, archaeologists have found clusters of female skeletons, their ages ranging from adolescence to middle age. Many bear marks of violent death, broken necks, crushed skulls, stab wounds to the chest. They are the physical remnants of lives taken for funerals, testimonies written not in ink but in bone. The Mongol Empire left behind towering legacies of conquest, maps redrawn, dynasties toppled, trade routes extended across continents. But beneath that glory lies a hidden graveyard of women, denied honor in death as surely as they were denied dignity in life. Their bodies became part of an empire that consumed not only land and wealth, but human beings. When we speak of Genghis Khan buried in secrecy, when we admire the treasures of Mongol rulers, we must remember the women sealed alive beside them, forgotten beneath the earth. The empire's greatness was measured in tombs and monuments. Its cruelty was measured in the silence of enslaved women who never received burial, never received remembrance, never received peace. For the Mongols, death was the final stage of ownership. For their enslaved women, it was the final stage of erasure. Centuries later, the steppe winds still sweep over the lands once ruled by the Mongols. The empire is gone, its cities reduced to ruins, its armies long vanished. But beneath the soil, the bones remain. Archaeologists digging near former encampments and burial sites uncover skeletons of women, spines bent from carrying impossible loads, knees locked in unnatural angles from grinding grain, ribs fractured from repeated blows. Some skulls bear marks of blades, others show the telltale scars of branding irons burned deep into bone. In mass graves, clusters of young women lie side by side, many with their wrists bound, mute testimony to ritual executions. Among them, the remains of girls as young as 12, their teeth worn down by grit in bread, their neck vertebrae compressed from endless water hauling, their pelvises scarred from pregnancies endured too early. These discoveries confirm what chronicles hinted at, but rarely cared to detail, that the Mongol Empire was built not only with cavalry charges and siege engines, but with the bodies of enslaved women. The girl from Khwarezmia, the nameless 14-year-old whose story opened this journey, may never be identified. Her bones may lie in one of those unmarked pits or beneath the foundations of a noble's tomb or scattered on a forgotten plain. Archaeologists will never know her name, the sound of her voice, or the dreams she once carried before the Mongols came, but the evidence of her suffering survives in the trauma etched into skeletons like hers, bones that speak when written history chose silence. Every Mongol monument, every conquest, every tale of glory came at this cost. The empire's expansion was not only a map colored in red, but a trail of broken bodies left across Eurasia. The tents of Karakoram glittered because enslaved women stitched them. The armies rode because women fed them, tended their horses, bore their sons. The tombs of great Khans were sealed with women's blood. Yet modern narratives often forget this. Today, Genghis Khan is sometimes celebrated as a visionary, a unifier, even a progressive ruler. His name adorns airports, universities, and even vodka bottles. Popular histories marvel at his military genius and the vastness of his empire. They praise the stability of trade under the Pax Mongolica. They speak of his tolerance for religions, his innovations in law, but they rarely speak of the women, the harems of concubines collected like trophies, the children born into chains, the captives branded, mutilated, humiliated in public squares, the women sealed alive in tombs to ensure secrecy. To romanticize the empire without acknowledging these crimes is to repeat the very erasure the Mongols engineered. The Mongols left behind chronicles filled with victories and dynasties, but the women they enslaved left no written records. Their stories survive only in fragments, in complaints scribbled by foreign observers, in bones dug from the earth, in scars preserved by time. They cannot speak for themselves. That responsibility falls on us. Their suffering must not be forgotten. When you hear of Mongol tolerance, remember the women tattooed and branded as property. When you read of Mongol wealth, remember the women who wove the fabrics until their fingers bled. When you admire the conquests of Genghis Khan, remember the concubines forced to serve, the girls stolen from their childhoods, the mothers separated from their children. When you hear of Mongol burials, remember the women buried alive, their cries silenced beneath stone. The empire's achievements cannot be separated from the cruelty that made them possible. The horseman's bow, the lightning-fast raids, the Silk Road trade, all of it was underpinned by a system of slavery that consumed women wholesale. To forget that is to admire the shine of a blade without acknowledging the blood that stains it. The girl from Khwarezmia, nameless though she remains, becomes a symbol for all of them. Through her imagined journey, we see what statistics and chronicles erase. She represents the millions whose lives were devoured by conquest, whose bodies became resources for an empire, whose memories were deliberately destroyed. She deserves to be remembered. They all do. And now, as you reach the end of this story, the responsibility passes to you, to remember, to share, to refuse silence. If you've watched this far and you still haven't subscribed to the History Scar, ask yourself, why? These women's stories are erased enough. Don't let your silence erase them again. Subscribe, like, and share this video so their voices are finally heard. Tell others what textbooks omit. Speak for those who were silenced, because history is not only kings and conquests, it is also the suffering of those whose names were never written down. And only when we tell their stories do we see the past clearly. The Mongol Empire has long since fallen. Its rulers are dust, its monuments crumbled, but the bones of its victims remain, whispering beneath the soil, whispering of hunger, of pain, of humiliation, whispering for remembrance.